The winter of 1864 had been one of the hardest remembered in the farming towns of rural Michigan. The fields lay buried beneath ice, the rivers frozen to silence, and entire families huddled in barns as their homes could not keep out the cold. It was during this season of hardship that the parishioners of a remote settlement raised their church. They called it Saint Agnes, a simple wooden structure perched on ground once used by native tribes for burial. Few questioned why the land had been sold so cheap, or why nothing had grown there in decades. They only knew they wanted a house of God, a place where their dead might rest with dignity and their living might feel hope. The church went up quickly, boards nailed while breath froze on the hammer. When it was finished, they brought in priests traveling under the guidance of Bishop Peter Paul Lefevere to bless the foundation. Yet from the very first prayer, something felt wrong. The men and women who filled its benches noticed it before the blessing was even done. Their voices, meant to rise in unison, seemed to sink instead. The walls swallowed sound. A hymn that should have lifted them seemed to fall flat, muffled as though each word had been caught and buried. Children whispered it was a church with no echo, that the saints did not hear them. Some claimed when the priest called upon the name of God, his voice sounded as if it were pushed back into his throat, strangled by the air itself. Others said the silence felt thicker than stone, that it pressed upon their chests until breathing felt like labor. Still, they told themselves this was superstition, the mind's trick when a building is new. They laughed it off, but no one truly forgot that first strange hush. Over time, the church became the only place people gathered. It held weddings and burials, sermons and confessions, but it never lost its quiet. Those who confessed their sins complained that their words seemed drained of force, as if spoken into water. Lovers who wed at its altar swore the vows they spoke to each other faded before they were finished. Even cries of mourning for the dead sounded dull, like grief buried in cotton. At first, this strangeness became a point of fascination, a quirk of the building, but fascination slowly turned to unease. They said it was like praying in a coffin. Every sound seemed to be absorbed by something unseen. The faithful would step outside afterward and realize only then how loud the world was. There was more. When heavy rains came, the wood of the floor darkened unnaturally, the grains swelling in shapes too much like veins. The parish children told stories of stains that looked like hands pressed into the planks. If one knelt too long in the pews, the knees grew wet, though no leak could be found in the roof. The elders of the town dismissed such talk, but late at night even they whispered that the ground beneath had been spoiled long before the first nail was driven. The native people had once warned that this land held voices of their dead, and that nothing built upon it would know peace. But these warnings had been dismissed as heathen superstition, buried beneath the certainty of holy construction. It was Bishop Lefevere himself who visited once more after complaints of the unsettling silence reached him. He stood within the nave, hands folded, listening to the voices of the congregation. He acknowledged the strange muffling, but dismissed it as the quirks of lumber and winter dampness. He told them faith was stronger than acoustics and left. Yet when he departed, he advised that the church be given a steady priest, someone who could lead them without letting imagination fester. The people felt relief at his words, but unease lingered. They had hoped he would find some flaw in the beams or a crack in the walls. He had found nothing. It left them wondering if the silence belonged not to the building but to something buried beneath. The truth of the church would not appear suddenly. It would arrive slowly through the way it changed those who entered. Parishioners confessed that after kneeling long in prayer they felt drained, as though their voices had been taken from them. Mothers claimed their children grew pale after communion, eyes hollow as though the silence had pressed into their bones. Farmers who spent hours repairing the roof or sweeping the nave returned home to their families unable to speak above a whisper. And always there were the floorboards. They seemed to hunger for moisture, to drink sweat and blood alike. When a man cut his hand on a loose nail, his blood spilled across the wood and left a mark that never faded. It was said the church was not built on silence but fed upon it, and fed as well upon every drop of pain that touched its boards. The people kept coming because they feared not to. To abandon the parish would mark them as faithless, and in those years faith was the only comfort they had against cold and hunger. They told themselves every church had its shadows, that the saints tested believers with discomfort. But inside each knew they sat upon something that did not belong to heaven. They knew the silence was not absence but appetite. They did not yet know whose appetite it was. What began as unease would grow into obsession for the man chosen to lead them, a man who appeared as kind as he was meticulous, a priest with gentle eyes and careful manners. His arrival seemed a gift, but it would prove the curse that brought the true nature of Saint Agnes to life. For what the congregation could not explain, he would study. What they whispered about, he would test. And where the boards thirsted, he would make them drink. Father Elias Mallory arrived in the spring thaw of 1864, his boots carrying the dust of long roads from Quebec. He was not old, but he carried himself with the patience of one who measured every breath before he spoke. His eyes were clear, almost painfully gentle, the kind of eyes that disarmed suspicion before it could form. The townsfolk saw him as a blessing, a man sent to steady the unsettled heart of St. Agnes. He greeted children with soft words, pressed weathered hands between his own, and spoke of devotion and sacrifice in tones so calm they seemed to soothe the silence of the church itself. Many said the building even sounded different when he preached, though the echo never truly returned. They believed faith had found its anchor. Yet beneath his gentleness there was something more patient, something calculating. Mallory's sermons were filled with talk of purity, of holiness measured not by wealth or harvest, but by the willingness to suffer. He spoke often of how Christ's wounds were not just endured but chosen, how sanctity was revealed only when the body was broken open. At first these words were taken as signs of his deep piety, but when he lingered too long on the subject of suffering, his listeners grew uneasy. Still, they did not question. He was their priest, and they had waited for guidance. What they did not know was that Mallory spent his evenings alone in the rectory, drawing diagrams by candlelight. Not of stained glass or holy shrines, but of human anatomy sketched with obsessive detail. He studied the shape of ribs, the chambers of lungs, the chords of the throat. He stitched sheets of parchment with animal sinew, testing how flesh could be pulled taut, how seams held beneath pressure. His notebooks were hidden in a locked chest beneath his bed. each page marked with small prayers scrawled in Latin, as if holy words could sanctify cruelty. It began with whispers to the children. He told them holiness must be measured. He placed them in rows, hands clasped, and asked them to hold their breath while he counted. He timed how long it took before their faces reddened, before their chests heaved. He touched their throats and spoke of the breath of God within. Some laughed nervously, thinking it a game. Others trembled but obeyed. He wrote each number carefully into his journal, noting which child held faith the longest. Parents heard of these tests and dismissed them as harmless exercises. They did not yet understand Mallory was building a catalog of lungs and bones, a record of how life could be stretched and bent beneath the weight of his belief. When sickness struck a local farmhand, Mallory offered to keep vigil. The man's fever burned, and his family thanked the priest for staying through the night. But in that locked room, Mallory tried something else. He tied cloths soaked in vinegar around the man's face, restricting his breath, whispering prayers into his ear as the man struggled. He loosened the cloths only when his subject neared collapse, then tightened them again, watching the rhythms of panic. He told himself this was mercy, a chance to see if fear could be turned into grace. By dawn, the man was dead, and Mallory reported solemnly that God had called him home. The family grieved, never knowing their loved one's last night had been used as an experiment in devotion. The priest buried him in consecrated ground and walked away with new notes to add to his journals. He did not rush his work. He believed holiness was not won in haste, but crafted like an instrument, shaped through careful adjustments. He turned his attention next to sound. He spoke of how voices revealed the soul, how hymns could carry truth or hide corruption. He lined the choir with children, teaching them to sing until their voices cracked. He fed them salted water before practice, drying their throats to hear the difference. When one girl fainted, he caught her gently, whispering that her weakness was a gift. In secret, he wrote that the thinness of her voice proved the body could be tuned like a string. He was not content to observe. He wanted to make the music of holiness himself. Mallory's methods left traces. Those who left confession with him often returned pale, as if something had been drawn from them. He listened too long, breathing with them, repeating their sins until they felt emptied of self. Some swore he pressed their hands to his chest so they could feel the rhythm of his heart, telling them this was how God measured truth. His touch lingered, always soft, never harsh, but it unsettled. Parishioners tried to silence their doubts, reminding themselves he spoke of Christ with such care. But unease grew beneath their obedience. The first body he buried with his own hands was not questioned. A woman who had suffered long with illness, taken into his care at the rectory, was said to have died peacefully. No one saw the bruises around her ribs or the punctures along her arms where Mallory had tested how much pain the body could absorb without losing its voice. He listened as she prayed through clenched teeth, then recorded when her prayer fell into gasps. Her last words were not to God but to him, a plea he noted with fascination. He covered her with a shroud, told the town her suffering had revealed her sainthood, and lowered her into the earth with solemnity. The congregation wept with gratitude. Mallory wept too, though not for her, but for the perfection of her endurance. What made him dangerous was not rage, but patience. He smiled when others recoiled. He bowed when suspicion rose, and he cloaked his rituals in scripture. To those around him, he was a man of God, gentle and precise. Only in the quiet of night did the truth emerge. He was not simply serving faith, he was dissecting it, testing it, carving it into flesh. Each experiment was a step towards something larger, something hidden beneath the surface of prayer. He believed Saint Agnes was built for him, that its silence was the perfect chamber to hold the music of suffering. And with each body he measured, each voice he broke, the church seemed to listen more intently, its boards darkening beneath the weight of what it absorbed. The townsfolk did not yet see the pattern. They saw only a kind priest devoted to their salvation. But the floorboards of St. Agnes were beginning to stain, and soon they would bleed. It happened after a midnight mass, when the congregation had filed out into the cold and only the glow of the altar candles remained. A boy of 12 lingered, the youngest son of a farm family known for his quiet nature and uneven gait. He often stayed behind, sweeping the aisles or carrying hymnals to the back room, and so no one questioned his absence until morning. His parents thought he had walked home with neighbors. The neighbors thought he had gone on ahead. By dawn, the confusion hardened into panic. The boy's bed had not been touched, his coat still hung by the door, and his place at the breakfast table was empty. The town gathered, voices hushed, but no trace of him was found in field or barn. Only hours later, when the church doors were unlocked again, did they discover his shoes placed neatly on the altar rail, the leather damp as though washed in tears. Father Mallory spoke of sorrow and mystery, his gentle voice breaking as he told the family their child had surely been called to God. He offered prayers and lit candles, assuring the community heaven had chosen one of their own. His words calmed some, but unease rippled beneath the surface. The shoes were too deliberate, the arrangement too exact. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering that it was not God who had taken him, but something else. Still, no one dared accuse their priest. Mallory was grief itself, kneeling for hours, head bowed, murmuring scripture. He wept openly, and the congregation mistook performance for piety. What they could not see was what had unfolded in the hours after Mass, when Mallory led the boy into the hidden chamber beneath the floorboards. He told him this was a sacred place, a space where saints were tested. He asked him to kneel, to breathe slowly, to listen to the silence. Then he drove thin nails into the boy's shins, sliding them carefully until they pressed the marrow. Mallory leaned close, urging him to pray, recording each cry in his journal as if cataloging music. He pressed harder, studying how screams shifted in pitch when pain cut deeper into bone. The boy pleaded through sobs, his prayers broken into gasps. But Mallory was not moved. He wanted to know whether prayer could survive agony, whether the voice of faith could be forced into silence. When the boy's breath caught and would not return, Mallory waited, watching the light drain from his eyes. He whispered a blessing as though it absolved him of the act. Then he removed the nails and set the body aside, tracing blood stains across the wood with his finger like a signature. The body was never buried. Mallory had no use for ceremony. He dismantled it carefully, piece by piece, fascinated by how silence seemed to thicken around the boy as life left him. He believed the absence of sound was not natural but earned, that in the moment between the last scream and stillness, holiness entered. He cut away what he wanted to study and hid the rest beneath the planks, wrapping the remains in burlap soaked with brine to mask decay. He thought of it not as disposal but as consecration. St. Agnes itself would hold the boy, the church feeding on him as it had fed on silence. When the family came to the altar to pray, they knelt upon boards still damp. They thought it spilled wax, or some trick of water rising from the ground. Yet the stains spread wider, darkening the wood until even the bishop's blessing could not hide them. Parishioners began to whisper of bleeding floorboards. They said the church was weeping for the child, that grief had soaked into the very structure. But Mallory knew it was not grief. It was the mark of his first experiment, the sign that the church was becoming what he dreamed it could be. A vessel that absorbed suffering, a place where every drop of blood became scripture. The boy's absence cast a shadow across the town. Children were kept indoors after dark. Parents sat by windows through the night, straining to hear footsteps that never came. His mother wasted away, convinced she still heard her son's voice echoing faintly in the silence of the pews. But when she leaned closer, she swore the sound was not his prayers, but his screams trapped beneath the boards, muffled as though swallowed whole. Others dismissed her as a woman undone by grief. Yet even those who doubted grew uneasy. Each time they entered the church, they felt they were stepping into a tomb, not a sanctuary. Mallory thrived in their fear. He cloaked himself in their sorrow, leading vigils, urging them to see loss as a form of holiness. He preached that suffering purified, that sacrifice was demanded. He told them the boy had not been lost but transformed, that heaven itself had reached through their parish to claim him. People wept at his words, mistaking manipulation for truth. Behind his mask of sorrow, Mallory felt triumph. His experiment had proven what he believed. Pain could be shaped. Prayer could be broken, and silence could be made to consume both. The stain on the floorboards never dried. Children refused to sit near it, swearing they felt heat rising from the wood. Some claimed if they pressed their ears to the planks, they could hear a faint moan. Farmers argued it was wind caught in the beams, but no breeze ever passed through the still church. The sound came only when prayers were spoken aloud, as if the boy's final cries had been grafted to the building itself. Mallory smiled at their fear, seeing it as confirmation. The church had begun to drink, and once it had tasted blood, it would hunger for more. The town carried on, unable to speak of their suspicions aloud. They buried their unease under hymns and harvests, telling themselves the missing boy was in heaven. But Mallory had already crossed the threshold from priest to predator, and with the first experiment, completed his hunger grew. He had measured pain and found it pliable. He had broken prayer and found silence waiting. He would not stop. He could not stop. And the floorboards of St. Agnes would never stop bleeding. The boy's disappearance had sealed something in Mallory's mind. He no longer questioned the strangeness of St. Agnes. He accepted it as a partner, a vessel hungry for what he wished to create. It was no longer enough to test pain in passing or to break a single body and leave it hidden in the ground. He wanted permanence, a system. If suffering could be shaped into sound, then sound itself could be bound to the church forever. He began his work in secret, chiseling through the foundation stones by lamplight. lowering himself into the damp earth beneath the altar. For weeks, muffled strikes echoed faintly at night, but the townsfolk dismissed it as shifting timber or the creak of ice. No one dared suspect their priest, who greeted them each dawn with calm prayers and folded hands. Beneath the floorboards, Mallory carved a hidden chamber. He smoothed the walls with ruthless care, measuring each corner as if preparing a shrine. Yet it was not holiness he intended to house. He built narrow wooden coffins, long boxes bound with iron clasps, their lids fitted with small holes drilled at the height of where a chest would rise. He placed reeds in the openings, whittled thin so air could whistle through. The chamber filled with these boxes, lined like pews in a church inverted, an altar of silence waiting to be fed. In his journals he wrote that the body was an instrument, that lungs could be tuned, and that death was not an end, but a resonance. The first to be taken was a man who had fallen into drunken ruin after the loss of his wife. The town thought him worthless, a burden who begged outside barns for scraps. Mallory took him under the promise of mercy, telling the villagers he would care for the man until he recovered. In truth, he locked him in one of the coffins, sealing the iron clasps, leaving only the small reed above his chest. As the man gasped, Mallory forced air through the holes with bellows. The sound that came was low, hollow, a moan that did not belong to human throat but to wood and reed. Mallory listened with rapture, pressing his ear to the lid as the voice wavered between sob and song. The victim's hands clawed at the sides, nails breaking, ribs bruised beneath the pressure, but Mallory only wrote in his journal that silence was being remade into music. Days later, the sound changed. The man's voice weakened, his breath thin, but still the reed moaned when air was pressed through. He lasted longer than Mallory expected, and that endurance fascinated him. When finally the coffin grew still, Mallory did not bury him. He left the body sealed within, certain that even in decay the lungs would hold echoes. And above in the nave the parishioners swore they heard winds sighing through the boards. They said it came when prayers were spoken aloud, a soft moan that rose with hymns. They dismissed it as drafts, though no doors stood open. Mallory was emboldened. He began selecting victims with purpose. A woman who whispered doubts about him vanished on her way home. Her coffin sang shriller than the drunkard's, her breath drawn into sharp notes as her body convulsed in the box. Mallory adjusted the reeds, widening holes until her gasps stretched into a trembling wail. Parishioners above thought they heard a storm rolling in, but the sky was clear. Another, a farmhand who defied him, was forced into a coffin face down so the reed pressed against his back. Each breath rasped into a hollow groan, a sound so unnatural that Mallory called it the language of sanctity. He told himself these deaths were sacrifices, each one turning silence into eternal chant. The victims did not vanish unnoticed. Families searched, lanterns sweeping across frozen fields, voices breaking in the dark. But with each disappearance, Mallory soothed them. He told them death was part of God's design, that wandering souls sometimes slipped into heaven without warning. He led masses in their honor, eyes wet with tears, his voice steady and soft. Grief blinded them to suspicion. And the more they mourned, the more they believed his sorrow was genuine. The only evidence was the church itself. The moans beneath the floor grew louder. Those who prayed at night swore they heard voices under their knees, layered in sound as though the parish had doubled in size with ghosts. The toll on the victims was hidden in darkness, but the toll on Mallory's mind was plain. He grew restless when the coffins lay still, anxious for new voices. His journals became crowded with notes on pitch, volume, and endurance. He wrote of marrow as if it were clay, of lungs as bellows, of throats as strings waiting to be plucked. He believed he was inventing something greater than music, something that would outlast flesh. He convinced himself he was not destroying souls but transforming them into a chorus that heaven itself must hear. Each moan was a hymn, each scream a psalm. The church absorbed these horrors without protest. The floorboards darkened, stains spreading in the shape of veins. Parishioners muttered about the strange smell of iron, but Mallory assured them it was only damp wood. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. For to question meant admitting they knelt above coffins filled not with relics but with their own. And so they silenced themselves, praying as the moans rose with their words, never daring to admit they were not praying alone. Mallory's invention had become his scripture. He no longer sought to guide his flock but to harvest them. Every coffin beneath St. Agnes was a testament, every voice trapped in eternal chant. And with each new death, the silence above grew heavier, as though the church itself pressed down to smother what it had consumed. The bleeding floorboards were no longer legend. They were alive with suffering. And Mallory was only just beginning to test how deep the silence could go. She was not the first to vanish beneath Mallory's hand, but she was the first he chose with ceremony. The widow of a blacksmith, a woman known for her sharp tongue, had spoken aloud doubts about the silence of St. Agnes. She had told her neighbors she felt the church drained prayers rather than raised them. In another town, her words might have been dismissed as grief, the ramblings of a woman who had buried her husband too young. But in Mallory's parish, where fear hung heavier than smoke, her defiance sounded like heresy. He marked her from the pulpit, speaking softly of blasphemy, of voices that threatened to poison faith. By the end of his sermon, the congregation sat in silence, not daring to defend her. When she disappeared days later, few asked where she had gone. They told themselves she had fled her shame. Only Mallory knew she had been taken to the chamber beneath the floorboards. Down in the dark, he prepared her as though for a ritual. The hidden room was no longer a hollow pit of coffins, but a gallery of torment. Walls lined with instruments he had crafted from wood and iron. He fixed her to a frame of pine, her arms spread wide until her body formed the shape of a crucifix. He locked her wrists and ankles into clamps, tightening them until the bone pressed against metal. She struggled, cursing him, demanding to be freed, but Mallory only whispered that holiness came through endurance. He pressed a hand against her heart and smiled at its rhythm, telling her that soon the church itself would drink her devotion. He began by opening veins along her arms with slow, deliberate cuts, not deep enough to kill her quickly, but wide enough to let blood spill across the untreated wood beneath her. He did not collect it in chalices or cups, for he believed such vessels corrupted the offering. Instead, he wanted the floor itself to absorb it. He watched as the pine planks swelled dark, the blood soaking into the fibers, spreading outward like roots. He muttered scripture as he worked, calling it a new sacrament, one not swallowed by man but by the house of God. The widow screamed until her throat broke into hoarse gasps, each sound sinking into the suffocating silence of the chamber. He told her that every cry was a hymn, every drop of blood a verse. Hours passed, her body weakening as the clamps cut deeper into her limbs. Mallory did not hurry. He adjusted the cuts with precision, ensuring her life drained slowly, that she remained conscious enough to understand her suffering. He spoke of her doubts, telling her this was the trial she had brought upon herself. He told her the church demanded her blood because her words had defiled its silence. She spat at him, even as her strength faded, and he wiped her face with his sleeve, recording the defiance in his journal as proof of her corruption. When her body finally sagged, her arms pulled tight against the iron clamps, she whispered a prayer that faltered into silence. He leaned close, listening for her last breath, savoring the moment when her voice fell away forever. When she collapsed, the floor beneath her was no longer pale pine but streaked with veins of blackened red. The stains spread outward in branching lines, patterns that looked too natural to be chance. Mallory traced them with his finger, marveling at how they resembled vessels beneath skin. He wrote that the church itself had grown veins, that it now carried blood like a living body. He left her nailed frame in place for days, watching as the wood dried around her, the stains settling like tattoos upon the boards. He believed the church had accepted her offering, that it had transformed her death into permanence. The congregation above could not ignore what followed. When rain swept through the valley, water seeped into the walls of St. Agnes, and with it, something darker. Drops of red bled through the planks, streaking down the altar steps. Parishioners swore they saw blood running from the seams of the floor, spreading across the nave like tears. Some said they smelled iron in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Children whispered that the church was weeping. But when they looked to their priest, Mallory only bowed his head and called it a sign. He told them St. Agnes had been chosen, that heaven itself had made the church bleed for their sins. He turned horror into miracle, and they believed him. The widow's name was never spoken again. Her home was abandoned, her possessions left to rot as if silence itself had erased her. The townsfolk pretended she had never existed, but fear hollowed their eyes. They entered the church with trembling hands, unwilling to admit the stains beneath their feet might be hers. At night, when storms shook the roof, they heard the boards groan as if the building itself suffered. Mothers held their children closer, whispering prayers not to God but to the church, begging it not to bleed again. Mallory walked among them with calm steps, his eyes as clear as ever. He had proven that the church could drink blood, that the silence within it could be fed until it swelled. He no longer saw himself as a shepherd, but as a surgeon of faith, shaping devotion through ritual pain. Each death was not loss, but invention. Each body not wasted, but transformed into proof that the church was alive. He told himself he was not killing, but consecrating, not destroying, but perfecting. And with the widow's trial complete, he was certain he had only begun to understand how far St. Agnes could go. Above ground, the congregation prayed in terror. Below, Mallory sharpened his knives, his journals waiting for new entries. The bleeding floorboards had tasted their first trial by blood, and he was ready to feed them again. By the spring of 1865, whispers had reached higher ears. Rumors of a church that bled when it rained, of parishioners who vanished into silence, of children who swore they heard moans beneath the pews. Most bishops would have dismissed such stories as peasant superstition, the tales of unlettered farmers clinging to fear. But Bishop Peter Paul Lefevre, guardian of the Catholic flock in Michigan, chose to see for himself. He arrived one gray morning, his carriage wheels sinking in mud, his face stern with the authority of Rome. The congregation greeted him with bowed heads, relieved that someone of higher rank would finally inspect what troubled their hearts. They hoped he would look beneath the floorboards, open the sealed doors, ask the questions they were too afraid to voice. Instead, they found themselves betrayed by silence yet again. Mallory welcomed the bishop with calm humility, his eyes clear, his voice soft. He showed him the hymns he had rewritten, pages carefully inked with verses that spoke of sacrifice, devotion, and obedience. He guided him through the nave, pointing out the candles, the repaired roof, the rows of kneeling benches. He avoided the darker corners where stains clung like shadows. The bishop paused once, his nose wrinkling at the faint metallic odor in the air, the unmistakable scent of iron. He remarked on it, asking if water from the roof had rusted the nails. Mallory smiled and nodded, offering a simple answer. Damp wood, perhaps some rot in the beams. The bishop accepted the excuse. He saw a devoted priest, a church that stood firm in the wilderness, and a congregation too afraid to speak truth. He left with blessings, promising to send more hymnals. The people watched him go, their hope draining with the sound of the departing carriage wheels. Mallory had passed inspection. That night, Mallory descended into his chamber with renewed purpose. Authority had looked into his house of torment and found nothing. This gave him license in his own mind to reach further. If no eye would punish him, then he was free to invent new ways to carve holiness into flesh. He chose his next victim carefully, a man who had argued with him weeks before, questioning why the widow had vanished, why so many were missing. Mallory saw him not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He told himself defiance was a sin of the tongue, that the organ of speech was the root of corruption. If words poisoned, then silence must be forced not by prayer alone, but by destruction of the very tongue. He bound the man to a chair in the hidden chamber, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and blood long dried. He soaked thick ropes in lye until the fibers burned to the touch, then wrapped them around the man's face, forcing the cords into his mouth, binding his tongue against his teeth. The victim choked, gagging, his muffled cries shaking the chamber, but Mallory held the knots firm. Hours passed, the lye eating into flesh, searing taste buds, dissolving the edges of the tongue. Mallory leaned close, whispering that he was cleansing him, stripping away the sin of speech. The man writhed, his eyes wide with horror as his mouth filled with blood and chemical burns. He gagged until he could no longer move, his body slumping as the ropes tightened deeper into raw pulp. Mallory did not kill him quickly. He watched the tongue blacken, watched the man struggle to form words that would never come. He believed he was witnessing transformation, a soul stripped of voice, rendered pure in silence. When the man finally died, his throat swollen, his tongue dissolved to ruin, Mallory sat in the stillness and wrote in his journal. He recorded every stage, the smell, the sound of muffled cries, the moment when silence overcame struggle. He called it the wordless sacrament, a ritual that proved sin could be erased by erasing speech itself. He did not bury the body in consecrated ground. Instead, he sealed it beneath the choir stalls, beneath the place where hymns rose each Sunday. He wanted the congregation to sing above a corpse stripped of song, a man whose voice had been destroyed in the name of holiness. He believed their hymns would mingle with his silence, that every note sung above was tethered to the mutilation below. The floorboards above warped with dampness, and some parishioners noticed the odd smell that lingered when they knelt. They said the air near the choir seemed thicker, that their throats grew dry as if someone else's suffering pressed against them. Still, they said nothing. Mallory's authority was unshaken, his face too calm, his sermons too steady. For Mallory, the bishop's visit had not been a warning but a confirmation. If the highest authority could be led away by hymns and false tears, then no one would ever stop him. He felt invincible, ordained not by Rome, but by silence itself. Each experiment deepened his belief that the church was alive, that it demanded blood and voice alike. He did not see himself as a murderer, but as a craftsman of faith, cutting away sin with methods too sharp and too cruel for others to understand. The people above felt only dread. They knelt on warped wood, singing songs that caught in their throats, praying with voices that sounded weaker each week. They whispered to each other that the church was sick, that the silence inside it was not holy but hungry. Yet they remained. Fear kept them seated in the pews, fear and the belief that to flee would condemn them as faithless. Mallory counted on that fear. He fed it with every sermon, every blessing, every calm smile that concealed the knives waiting below. The bishop never returned to St. Agnes. He spoke of the church only as a model of devotion in the frontier, praising Mallory for his piety. Meanwhile, beneath the choir stalls, a body rotted, its mouth ruined, its tongue gone. Mallory had proven to himself that the soul could be made wordless, that holiness could be carved through chemical and pain. And with that conviction, he sharpened his tools once more, ready to draw the next voice into silence. The orphans of the parish had always lingered at the edge of the congregation, thin figures in patched clothes, eyes wide as though the world had already taken too much from them. Their parents lost to war, to illness, to the endless accidents of frontier life. They were gathered by charity into the care of the church. Mallory saw in them not burdens but instruments, pliable bodies that could be shaped without resistance. He told the townsfolk that children's voices were closest to heaven, that their innocence rang purest in hymns. Parents and farmers, eager to believe, nodded in agreement and left the orphans in his care. They thought it kindness. They did not know it was selection. He began by forming them into a choir. He taught them new hymns written in his own hand, verses that spoke not of mercy but of surrender. He lined them before the altar, raising his hand for silence, and listened with rapture as their high voices filled the air. Yet he wanted more than sound. He wanted control over tone itself, to shape their voices into something unnatural. He began feeding them broths laced with pig's blood, vinegar, and bitter herbs. He told them it would keep their throats strong, but the mixture burned as it went down, scarring their vocal cords. Their voices grew shrill, uneven, cracked with strain. Mallory smiled at each change, writing notes in his journal. measuring how suffering altered sound. The children grew weaker, their faces pale, their mouths stained red from the broth. But they obeyed, too afraid of his calm authority, too desperate for belonging to resist. When one fainted during rehearsal, he lifted her gently, whispering that her weakness was a gift, that holiness revealed itself in pain. He recorded the moment with care, calling it proof that suffering tuned the soul. Night after night he pushed them harder, making them sing until their voices broke into screams. He listened as though hearing an organ, each voice another key he could press. Yet he was not content with practice. He wanted permanence. The first child to vanish was a boy of 9, small and quiet, whose voice cracked like glass when he sang. Mallory took him after evening prayer, leading him into the chamber below. He pressed the child onto a wooden table, murmuring that his voice must be preserved. With surgical precision, he cut into the boy's throat, slicing along lines he had drawn with chalk. The cuts were not random. They resembled the hollow pipes of an organ carved into living flesh. The boy thrashed, his cries turning wet, but Mallory held him firm, listening as the gurgling breath whistled through the incisions. He adjusted the angles until the sound pleased him, then let the body collapse, its throat forever shaped into a grotesque instrument. He sealed it within the hollow boards beneath the altar, believing the church would capture the voice, hold it eternally. More children followed. One by one, they disappeared. After practice, their small shoes left behind near the pews. Mallory cut each throat in patterns, some wide, some narrow, carving variations like pipes in a cathedral organ. He pressed air through their wounds, listening to the different tones. Some moaned low, others hissed high, and he recorded each with obsessive detail. He called it installation, as though he were placing voices into the church itself. He believed saint. Agnes was becoming a living instrument, a choir of blood and silence woven together. The congregation noticed the absences but clung to denial. Mallory told them the children had been placed with families in other towns, that they had been given homes through church charity. Few questioned him. Those who did were silenced by his calm eyes, his steady assurances. Yet the church itself betrayed the truth. When parishioners knelt in prayer, they swore they heard faint weeping beneath them. Some heard high-pitched wails that rose and fell with the hymns. Others said they felt vibrations through the wood as though tiny lungs still gasped beneath the floor. They told themselves it was imagination, that grief for lost children twisted their senses. But when storms shook the roof, the voices grew louder, a chorus of muffled cries that no wind could explain. The children who remained grew silent, their eyes hollow. They sang when commanded, but their voices trembled, breaking with terror. They knew what had happened to their friends, though they dared not speak it. Mallory saw their fear and relished it. He told himself it was proof of faith, that silence was their devotion. He worked with renewed zeal, carving more patterns, testing new mixtures of broth and blood, each experiment designed to twist the voice further. The floorboards beneath the altar darkened with stains that spread outward in branching shapes, veins feeding into the nave. Some parishioners swore they saw the wood pulse when candles flickered. The psychological toll on the congregation deepened. Parents who had once trusted Mallory now looked at him with unease, but fear kept them quiet. They told themselves their suspicions were sinful. that doubting a priest was doubting God. Mallory thrived in this silence, feeding it with every sermon, twisting their dread into reverence. He told them suffering was the highest form of praise, that even the smallest voices must be offered to heaven. They bowed their heads, too frightened to defy him, too broken to leave. Beneath their feet the children's voices did not fade. They lingered in the boards, thin and mournful, weeping in unison with every prayer. The church had become a tomb, an organ built of suffering, and Mallory believed it was the closest thing to paradise he had ever created. He wrote that heaven was no longer distant, that it had been installed in wood and blood, and with each cut, each child, he stepped further from priesthood into something darker, something that even the silence of St. Agnes seemed eager to embrace. By the winter of 1866, the town around St. Agnes was hollowed. The families who had once filled the pews had thinned to shadows, many gone without explanation. Their homes left with doors ajar and tables still set for meals that were never eaten. Fear wrapped itself around the parish like frost on glass. The few who remained whispered of sickness, of strange wasting that fell upon those who prayed too long beneath the stained boards. They spoke of fevers that came without cause, of bleeding from the throat, of children who no longer woke after singing. When news of this spread beyond the valley, it reached the ears of a physician traveling the region, a man named Dr. Nathaniel Clark. He was a skeptic, hardened by years of war medicine, one who had cut limbs from boys on battlefields and who no longer believed in miracles. He came not for faith, but to diagnose, to expose superstition as folly. What he found broke even his hardened reason. Clark entered the church on a bleak morning, the air sharp with the smell of iron. His boots echoed softly, though he noticed at once the strange muffling, as if sound were being swallowed. He walked the aisles, observing the warped planks, the stains that seemed too dark and too patterned to be simple water damage. Parishioners watched him with hollow eyes, their silence more eloquent than confession. Clark spoke with them, listened to their failing voices, and examined the children who remained. Their throats were raw, their breath shallow, as though something had scraped their lungs from within. He knew illness when he saw it, but this was not illness, it was injury. It was harm deliberately inflicted. When he requested entry to the rectory, Mallory welcomed him with a gentle smile, showing him hymnals and clean rooms. Clark, suspicious, searched further. In a locked drawer, he uncovered scraps of parchment, torn and smudged, but unmistakable. They were sketches, anatomical diagrams not drawn with a healer's hand, but with an obsessive cruelty. He found images of bodies bent backward until the spine formed an arc, ribs pulled open like wings. He saw drawings of veins braided together like harp strings, notes scrawled beside them describing pitch and resonance. There were torsos marked with slashes, instructions on how to carve flesh so it would produce sound when struck. Clark read the notes and felt his chest tighten. These were not medical records. They were instructions for turning bodies into instruments. The physician pressed on, searching the hidden spaces beneath the floor. There he found remnants the congregation had never dared to see. Fragments of coffins, boards stained black with blood that no rain could wash away. He uncovered bones carved with precision, hollows drilled into them as if they had been fashioned into flutes. He found ligaments stretched across wooden frames, dried and brittle, arranged in ways that suggested they had once been plucked like strings. The smell of rot was thick, but worse was the orderliness of it all. This was not chaos, this was craft. It was science stripped of mercy and rebuilt as ritual. Clark recoiled, but he could not deny what lay before him. He described later in his notes that what he saw was cruelty carved into scripture. Mallory had taken the principles of anatomy, the study of vessels and lungs and resonance, and fused them with his own twisted theology. Every body was an offering, every incision a verse. Mallory's journals, the scraps Clark recovered, were filled with phrases that blurred faith and experiment. Sound extracted by agony, prayer tuned by marrow, silence achieved through rupture. Clark had studied men broken by war, but never had he seen suffering so deliberately shaped. He realized then that Mallory was not a priest who had lost his way. He was a craftsman of torment, a mind who saw in every body not a soul to save but an instrument to build. The physician left the chamber with horror etched into his face. He spoke to the few remaining townsfolk, warning them that their church was not holy but a machine of death. But his words fell on ears too broken by fear to act. They looked at him with empty stares, their faith collapsed but their will gone. Some wept, confessing that they had known something was wrong but had been too afraid to resist. Others whispered that it was too late, that the church itself was alive, that leaving it would only bring its curse into their homes. Clark urged them to abandon Saint Agnes, but they clung to silence, trapped in the web Mallory had spun. By then, half the parish was gone. Families vanished into the earth, their names spoken only in whispers. The pews were filled with absence, hymns sung by voices that trembled under the weight of unseen cries rising from the boards. The church no longer felt like a gathering place, but like a tomb. Clark wrote in his records that he had stumbled upon the collapse of faith itself. That belief had been twisted into submission so complete that even when the truth stood in front of them, the people could not act. He left Saint Agnes shaken, carrying fragments of journals as proof, but he knew they would never be enough. Who would believe that a priest had turned his flock into instruments? Who would believe that a church bled? Mallory, untouched, continued his work. He watched Clark depart and knew he would not return. He saw in the physician's horror not danger but confirmation. Even a man of science had been silenced by the scope of his invention. Mallory wrote that night that St. Agnes had passed from faith into eternity, that it no longer required belief, only bodies. He sharpened his blades, prepared his coffins, and waited for the next voice to fall into silence. The parish was dying, the people broken, their faith rotted into dread. The collapse of faith was complete. What remained was not worship, but obedience to a house of torment and to the man who ruled it with the calm smile of innocence masking the mind of a psychopath. The storm that came in the spring of 1867 was unlike any the valley had seen. Wind tore shingles from roofs, lightning split the sky, and rain fell in sheets so heavy the riverbanks swelled and fields sank beneath water. St. Agnes stood in the heart of it all, its steeple swaying against the violence of the storm. The townsfolk huddled in their homes, listening as thunder rolled, but none dared step inside the church. For months they had avoided it, their fear too sharp, their faith too broken. They whispered that the building itself was cursed, that its silence had grown so heavy it could smother a soul. Yet on that night the silence finally broke. When the storm reached its height, the roof of St. Agnes split apart, boards shattering beneath the weight of wind and rain. And through those broken seams came the horror no one could ignore. The survivors who crept to the church at dawn found streams of water dripping through the floorboards, but the water was not clear. It was dark, streaked with red. The nave smelled of iron, heavy and unmistakable. Rain mixed with blood seeped through the cracks, spreading across the stone steps like tears. The people gasped, some turning away, others falling to their knees in terror. They had feared their church drank blood, but now they saw it bleed. The storm had torn open its secret. They broke the doors and entered, and the sight inside froze their voices. Bones stood in columns along the walls, stacked with methodical care, each vertebra aligned as though part of a grotesque architecture. Skulls dangled from cords, strung together like rosaries, their hollow eyes watching the intruders. Femurs and ribs were tied with wire, forming lattices across the chamber, an altar built from the parish itself. The floor was slick with old stains, dark patterns that spread outward in veins. The smell of rot hung thick, mingled with the sour dampness of rain. The silence that once suffocated the place was gone, replaced by the faint drip of water hitting skulls, the hollow clatter of bone on bone. The people stumbled deeper, trembling. They had suspected the missing were beneath their feet, but they had never imagined such order, such ritual. This was not the chaos of slaughter. This was devotion turned into architecture. Each body had been placed with purpose, each bone arranged as though part of scripture. It was the work of years, not hours. And at the center of it all, they found the last horror Mallory had left behind. His own body hung in the hidden chamber, strung with wires that cut through his flesh and pinned him upright like an instrument. His ribs had been carved open, widened until they spread like the frame of a harp. Fine wires ran from bone to bone, stretched taut across his chest. His hands were nailed in place, fingers splayed as though caught in the act of conducting. His head slumped forward, eyes sunken, lips parted, in what might have been a final hymn. But there was no sound, only silence. Mallory had made himself into his last experiment, the perfect hymn he believed would bind his soul to the church. The survivors stared, paralyzed by the sight. They saw in his body not only madness but method. Every wire was measured, every cut deliberate. He had not died in chaos but in pursuit of order, shaping his own flesh into an instrument to prove his twisted faith. For years he had forced voices into silence, carved bodies into tools, drained blood into wood. Now he had turned his obsession inward, convinced that if he became the instrument, his voice would never fade. Yet the silence around him was absolute. His final act had ended not in eternal song, but in emptiness. The storm shattered St. Agnes, leaving its roof torn, its floor bleeding red with rain. Survivors entered and found bones stacked in columns, skulls tied like rosaries, and Mallory's body strung with wires, ribs carved into an instrument. His perfect hymn ended in silence. The people fled, never returning, their faith buried with the dead. Officials spoke nothing, but laws around autopsy and burial quietly shifted. Locals swore the church's wood was buried deep, forbidden to be reused, and that when storms came, the ground itself hummed. Silence became its legacy, more powerful than fire. Families who lived through it carried guilt, passing down only quiet. Historians later found gaps in records, proof erased by design. Evil had not raged, but waited, hiding in holy walls, patient and unseen. St. Agnes is gone, yet the question endures. How many sanctuaries still hide horrors beneath their boards?